Okay. All right, so I'm going to get started because I have a lot to say and I want to get you out of here before lunch ends. So this should come back on if I hit this button. Great. Okay. So my name is Kevin Wolz. Quick introduction. I am not going to stand in front of that projector. I'm a senior in integrative biology and environmental engineering. I'm glad to hear one other double major across campus. That was great. So I'm a senior here. This is kind of what I do and what I think about a lot. And I'm really glad that Misty invited me. I've heard so much about all the talks over here. So I'm going to, in the spirit of the math and science kind of engineering side of things, I created a new kind of version of my spiel for the math and engineers of the crowd, and that's kind of what Misty focuses on. So I'm going to start with a lot of pretty pictures. I'm going to talk about some philosophy, then throw a lot of graphs at you, and then pose some interesting questions and tell you what we're actually doing. So a few disclaimers before I keep going is that I've given a lot of presentations on this kind of topic before, but I've never done this kind of math engineering swing to it. So bear with me a little bit as I try and speak from that side of my brain. I will go over a lot. My goal is kind of just to stimulate while you're thinking about this thing. So don't worry too much if you don't get all the gory details, or if I'm talking really fast. I'm just trying to say a lot. So and I guess everything that I'm saying here is kind of, so it's new to me too, so it's really mostly just my opinion. It doesn't necessarily represent my lab group or the nonprofit or anything like that I'm associated with. So with that, we'll come back to this picture, but I hope that's at least got you thinking a little bit about what I'll be talking about. Okay, so before we talk about ecosystem engineering, which is kind of a new phrase, I want to talk about what an ecosystem is, because not everyone here is a biologist. So this is a map of the United States, which supposedly has 551 distinct ecosystem flavors, if you will, across the US. So this is from the USGS, and just to give you an idea of what an ecosystem is, textbook definition: a system involving the interactions between a community of living organisms in a particular area and its non-living environment. So there's always that living and non-living stuff together, which is what makes an ecosystem. Another version, I kind of stumbled across this definition, but I like it better. It's a complex set of relationships, so that kind of makes you think about that optimization part of the title of the talk, of living resources, habitats, residents of an area, and it includes plant, trees, animals, fish, birds, microorganisms, water, soil, and people. And that last word is kind of controversial, actually. Some ecologists don't think that people are part of ecosystems, technically, but some people do. So we'll come back to that. And so I kind of want to see if you guys can just pick out a few things from this map here. So does anyone know, for example, what these red areas are, kind of dotted red areas? What color or what ecosystem does that represent on the map? Cities, urban, right? So that's, in a way, an ecosystem, right? And then how about this kind of whitish, yellowish thing here? And if you can't figure it out, here is a zoom in of Champaign County. Maybe that will help. Yes, crop, so cropland, annual agriculture, ecosystem. Kind of a desolate picture, isn't it? Okay, so a little fun to get everyone excited while you're eating your awesome pizza, which, by the way, you all lucked out. I was told that it's not Pappardell's every week, so you really lucked out. This is the week you came. We're going to do this really rapid fire so everyone gets excited and starts thinking about ecosystems they're familiar with. So I'm going to point to one, and you're going to tell me where it is or what you see, or just kind of let's figure out where these places are. Ready, go. No. Come on, starts with B. No. South Dakota. Badlands. To the right. No. California. Volcano. Extinct. Crater Lake. Good. One of the two big trees in California. Sequoia. Washington. Yeah, over there, right. The Olympic, the rainforest, that place. Oregon, very good. This guy here? Desolate, everything is knocked over. Mount St. Helens, yeah. Here, colorful water. Yellowstone, hot springs. This dam. Grand Coulee Dam. Here we go, next one. Probably Nevada. Yeah, Saguaro National Park. Saguaro cactus. West. Colorado, yeah. Rocky Mountain National Park or so. The national park. The name of the national park is this structure. Arches. This guy. Famous picture. Half Dome is in Yosemite, okay. The other big tree in California. Redwood. One of those other lots of national parks in Nevada. National park that pretty much no one knows about in Southern California. Has these weird trees which are in the name. Joshua Tree. Yeah. And then a point for the biologist or 2 points for the non-biologist who can actually identify what that is. The red thing in the bottom right-hand corner. Not a flower. Oh, sorry. It's a plant. Biologist, come on. Parasitic plant, yes. Darcy, you get 1 point, you're a biologist. Great, so it's red because it doesn't photosynthesize to get its energy. It uses energy and nutrients from the ground, so it doesn't need to be green, so it's red. It's stealing everything from the tree that it's next to. Okay, so those are our ecosystems. Now you guys all at least are familiar. You've probably been to at least one of those that I pointed to. So now we're talking about philosophy a little bit. So we talk about ecosystem engineering. Ecosystems are studied by ecologists, and engineering is done by engineers. So a little bit about the difference between these two. Again, you know, I've been involved in both of these while I'm here at U of I, and they are different. And this is just really broad kind of philosophical stuff. So ecologists use inductive reasoning to kind of pursue their questions, whereas engineers use deductive reasoning. Ecologists typically describe what they're studying in qualitative manners, and they really want to, and which kind of goes with the inductive reasoning. And then engineers do more quantitative type things with equations and math, and they really want to get simple universal equations. Ecologists typically deal with open systems, so they're totally fine with, I'm not sure where that, is everyone okay looking at that if I'm standing in front of this one? Ecologists deal with open systems where sometimes if they can't explain something that's not understood, they just say, well, it's kind of part of the system where things are interacting from the outside, and it's part of the stuff we don't understand. Well, as engineers typically isolate and reduce the system they're working with to a very specific, constrained scenario. Ecologists typically make complex conditional predictions where they say, there's this really big, cool thing happening, but it only happens if you do this and in this location and when this happens. Whereas engineers really try and make simple, confident predictions where they are coming up with, you know, a very three-variable equation which will predict kind of this whole range of how a metal will react or how something will happen. And lastly is that the ecological way of thinking kind of started way back when with Aristotle, whereas the engineering tradition started more with Socrates and Plato. If you guys want to read up on that, that's kind of cool. So those are the people involved. And then the systems they study, so we can generalize. The ecologists study natural systems, and engineers study built systems, or I don't really like unnatural systems. So here's some examples of that. I'm going to try and draw some parallels between the two. So in natural systems, big picture, you have an ecosystem like we're talking about here. That's kind of similar to, in a built system, you have an economy where it's totally kind of human constructed and everything's kind of working together. In a natural system, you have an organism. Within the economy, you can kind of think of that as a business working within that economy. A prairie is an example of an ecosystem. A soybean field would be an example of a kind of constructed artificial built system that is parallel to that. Photosynthesis is kind of a small scale process within an ecosystem, whereas you can think of a solar cell as a small scale process that's providing energy for that economy. And DNA is kind of like the library, the reading material, the information, the storage that the natural systems work off of, whereas we can think of our built systems work off of code or programming. And so there's a lot of parallels, but just to give you an idea of some qualitative measure on these two, we can think of natural systems having about 3.5 billion years of experience since life started on this planet, whereas built systems have, again, go back to when humans started kind of civilization and all that, got about 5,000 years of experience, if you really go back all the way. So there's a slight discrepancy between those two concepts. Okay, so we have ecologists and engineers, and we have natural systems and built systems, and obviously the typical way this goes about is ecologists study natural systems and engineers study built systems. That's great, but if we want to try and do cool things and innovate a little bit, we can change it up a bit. So one thing that you can do is you can have an ecologist infuse their ideas into built systems. And this is actually what I usually talk about, what got me into all this originally. And this is, people call it different things, but the word I like the best is biomimicry. And so an example of this would be everyone see on the right here, this is a wind turbine blade that has these weird bumps on the back of it, which was modeled off of the fin of a whale that also usually has barnacles and bumps kind of attached to the back. And so engineers were trying to develop a better wind turbine blade that was more aerodynamic and more efficient. And they said, well, how can we do that? And they looked at these whales, which you would think whales have these blade-type structures on them, and they need to be really efficient because they're huge and travel through the water. They said, why the heck do these whales have bumps on the back of their fins? That seems so stupid. Why has evolution not selected against that? And you have these really nice aerodynamic fins on the whales. So they probably didn't take an actual whale fin, but they made a model of it and stuck it in a wind tunnel and saw what was actually happening, and that those bumps on the back of the fin were actually creating these weird vortices at the back of the fin and made that shape more efficient as it traveled through the air. And so now they're making wind turbine blades mimicking that shape. So we have an ecological phenomenon or an idea that was translated into making an engineering application that was actually better. So that's one way to go about it. What we're going to talk about today is kind of the other way. And like I said, I'm approaching this kind of more for the first time compared to the other aspect. I'm proposing this might be called ecosystem engineering. And so in order to go the other way from engineers influencing the natural systems, first we have to ask the question, what do we actually know about natural systems? So if you're an engineer, you want to deal with a natural system, you want to know kind of what's going on out there. And I think that a lot of people aren't as familiar with what we know about ecosystems, especially what we know mathematically about ecosystems. And our mathematical understanding has just gone leaps and bounds in the last 20 to 30 years when biologists actually started using math to describe what they're observing. And so what I'm going to go through here next is just really quick, and again, I don't want you to understand necessarily everything, but I'm going to go through a really quick survey of what I think are relevant aspects of our mathematical understanding of biology. And so this is where all the really cool graphs come in. So if you're a mathematician or an engineer, this is where you can geek out, because I love graphs too. So we're going to go through really quick. So this is the engineering perspective. Okay, so what do we know about natural systems? I'm going to try and take this format as I go through. X-axis, I'm going to tell you the x-axis, y-axis, the relationship, and then things you could think about as you're looking at that. So x-axis is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and the y-axis is how well a plant photosynthesizes, or how much photosynthesis it's doing. So as you give it more stuff to photosynthesize with, it gets better, but it saturates, it doesn't keep going on forever. So we understand these small-scale, instantaneous type reactions that plants have to their environment. So that's really cool. And this is actually mechanistic. So this relationship is based on physical and chemical principles, which really makes it so engineers are okay with it. We can take the same relationship, there's the same graph, same axes, but we can look at it over a long time period. So if we're talking about engineering or optimizing a system, we want to know short time and long time scales. So it's the same thing, but the only difference is that these are plants that were grown at CO2 concentrations, different CO2 concentrations for a long time throughout their life. So if you have a plant grown at elevated CO2, which is the black dots, it actually lowers that whole curve over its lifetime. So now we know that plants also have, in a way, kind of a memory, and they're reacting over long time periods to their environment as well. Some people think that plants could never react in a long time period, they don't have a brain, but there you go. So we also, this is all plant level stuff right now, so we also know what's inside plants. So we care about this a lot because we want to grow stuff for food, and we want to know medicinal properties and stuff. So this is just an example of plants have different stuff in them. So we grow corn because it has lots and lots of carbs in it, and that's great for those type of applications. We have other plants that are really good at producing oil. which is what we want for fuel or cooking oil, stuff like that. So plants are different. We have lots of different species in the world, and those basically you can think of as from an engineering perspective as your toolbox, the things you have to work with to stick into your systems. Phonology. Phonology, as opposed to phonology, which I've messed this up with before, is the study of language and stuff with language and sounds. Phonology is the study of the timing of plants or the timing of ecosystems. So basically, when plants do stuff. So like leafing out in the spring, or putting out their flowers, or dropping their seeds, or senescing and turning different colors in the fall. And so this is one way to visualize this. So again, knowing that plants do different things at different times. The black line represents how much sunlight is hitting, or sorry, whoa. We gotta make sure you guys understand this. X-axis is month. So basically, as you progress through the year, Y-axis is basically energy or solar energy. So the black line represents how much sunlight is hitting the ground over the course of the year. This is northern hemisphere, by the way. So in the summer months, we have lots of sunlight. In the winter months, days are shorter, less sunlight. And the colored line represents how much of that energy plants are actually able to use. So this green line here is like a forest or savanna ecosystem. So it starts really early, it uses a lot, it can get really close to the maximum and then comes back down. As opposed to, for example, the red line is winter wheat. So winter wheat comes up really early, January, February. That's why farmers plant it. It gets there in the ground early, but then you harvest it in like May or June, and then it's done. And then corn here, you plant after that, and does really good, really quick, because it grows really, really fast. That's why we like it. But then as soon as you harvest it, come back down to zero, as opposed to that natural ecosystem, which is doing a lot of stuff, even a little bit in the early months and in the late months. So again, different plants are reacting at different times of year. We know these things. This one's a little more complicated, but you can simplify it pretty easy. X-axis is distance from the edge of a patch of garlic mustard, which is an invasive species here in the United States. So basically, they come in clumps, and how far away from that clump is on the X-axis, which negative would be like inside that clump. And then on the Y-axis here, we have root biomass for that clump of plants, that invasive species. And on this Y-axis, we have basically the fungi that are in that soil, the good fungi that are usually there. And so what we can see is that as you get far away from that patch of garlic mustard, as you get closer, you get more of the garlic mustard, more of the roots. Makes sense. But also as you get closer, things die. So the less and less of those good things in the soil are actually there. So it's basically a trade-off. As you have this invasive species, the more of it is there, the more of it that's there, the less of the other good stuff that's there. So this is why this plant is very good at invading, and also shows you that plants don't always get along. So if you're trying to optimize a system, if you put two things next to each other that don't actually like each other, that could totally screw everything up. So there are, in a way, kind of friendships and enemies within the plant world also that have to work together. You have to understand. Now moving up to an whole ecosystem level. So net ecosystem productivity. This is a measure of basically how much carbon is pulled out of the air during a given year. So plants photosynthesize, take carbon out of the air, and put it in their trunks of the soil. And this is an example of that. So each different line, I won't go through them all, each different line represents a different ecosystem. So we know that some ecosystems are really good at doing that, some not so much. So the red line is red line is shrubland. Right up at the top there, though, is tropical rainforest. So tropical rainforests, you think, are being these really super productive type things, but actually, once they're at maturity, they basically just stagnate. So they have a lot of stuff there, but they respirate just as much as they take in, and they're basically stagnant. So once you have a mature tropical forest, it's not doing much for sequestering carbon. This is really cool. So succession is one of the biggest pictures in ecology. So what succession is the kind of trajectory of an ecosystem from the beginning here is basically bare black earth field, and then the x-axis is just time. So as you go further, and the y-axis is basically productivity. So the gray shaded region is how productive it is over time. So you can see that in the beginning you don't have a lot, but there's this rapid increase. And you can see this in your gardens at home or in the abandoned field next to your house, that when you have an abandoned field, all those weeds come in really quickly and they go nuts, but they don't last very long. That's what weeds are, is basically this really initial rapid increase. Then you have this period in the middle where you kind of have this really optimal situation. You have a lot of productivity in that gray area. And then as the system matures, it kind of stagnates and plateaus as it goes on into time. So this is a very interesting concept, and so we know also these long time periods of big systems of what they're doing, and we'll come back to this in the end. We also know that different ecosystems are better at doing different things. So the y-axis here is basically how much plants are in an ecosystem, and the x-axis is plant biomass, and the y-axis is animal biomass. So basically, we get this really nice relationship of more plants, more animals, or vice versa. This isn't necessarily a causal relationship, but it's certainly correlated. And then we can see the different letters represent the different kind of ecosystem. So you can see there's a lot of S's up here at the top. And so what we kind of infer from this graph that as a result is that savannas, the savanna type ecosystem, seems to be very good at, yes, producing lots of plants, but also lots of animals at the same time. So if you're thinking about optimization, if you want both of those things, maybe that's the type of system you should employ. Whereas, sure, look at these forests here, the F, those might be tropical forests. Those are very good. They're even farther to the right for plants, but they're way lower on animals. So if you think of, if you go to the rainforest, yeah, there's lots of plants there, but how many big animals do you see in the rainforest? There's not a lot. There's like a few cats and, really birds and stuff, but if you're thinking about big animals, when you think of big animals, where do you think? Like the African savanna, you've got the elephants and the lions and all the antelope and zebra and all that. That's where the animals are. So that's kind of interesting that the different systems perform differently like that. Same axes here. This is where the humans come into the system. So again, plant stuff, animal stuff, and can humans have an impact on that? Can what we do actually change that? And so this is, again, that same relationship you saw before, just for grasslands, linear relationship. And this is for natural systems. But then if we actually manage that, whether it be grazing or mowing or fire, we can actually take that whole curve and shift it up. We can get more animals off of that same plant biomass than what the natural ecosystem can do. So this supports that we can actually, if we're just talking about animal biomass, increase or improve that ecosystem. We've been doing this for a long time. Grazers do it all the time. So we shift it up. These are some of my favorite graphs. So x-axis is the number of species. So imagine a square meter of land, and you have different numbers of species. Some squares have 1 species, some have 10, some have even more. So that's the x-axis. And the y-axis is basically productivity. How much stuff do the plants produce? How much biomass do they actually produce? And what we know now is that as you increase the number of species, you're in the same area here, you're actually able to produce more. So if you just have a square meter of a single plant versus a square meter of 5 different species kind of interacting together, you can get more biomass off of that than you can if you just have one, because maybe a lot of different things. So there's different niche competition happening and different ecology taking place. So that's really cool, and you get this nice saturating function. So maybe you don't want to go up here where there's like 20 or 30 species, because you're still going to get the same productivity. It stagnates, but maybe you want to be up here as opposed to down here. And you can see, so these different color lines represent different years. So starting in 1996 and going on, so basically the relationship gets better every year. So they all started about the same, but as you progress every year, you keep moving up and up and up and up and up. So the longer you let these multiple species interact, the better they'll even get. And the same thing, x-axis, is plant species richness, so the number of species you have in that square of land. But the y-axis now is drought resistance. How resistant is that square to dealing with a drought or dealing with some other disturbance? And basically, again, as you go up, you have more species, the better that system is at dealing with a drought. So that tells you that if you're trying to maximize drought resistance in your system, maybe you should plant more species. And then we have these really complicated feedbacks, kind of on the large scale. You don't necessarily need to go through all this, but this people talk about the Amazon dieback. So as climate change happens, different things happen and cause, let's say, forest fires, but which then causes more climate change. And so you can get into these positive feedback loops that can take a stable system and kind of go off in a crazy trajectory. And there's lots of these feedbacks in kind of the global climate system or in ecosystems. And a lot of them are positive, actually, which is interesting because positive feedbacks are not stable. And if they start taking off too much, that could be a problem. And again, coming back to the humans, we know humans are trying to be involved in ecosystems, right? So even if that definition in the beginning isn't necessarily right where humans aren't philosophically part of the ecosystem. We know that they're trying to be. So this is a map of how much farmers have spent on fertilizer, lime, and soil conditioners in the United States. And across the total US, and this should be 2007, we have approximately, as billion, that would be billion, $18 billion. So we know that humans know that they can influence ecosystems, and we know that they're trying. So this is definitely a relevant topic. And then this really complicated graph tying this all together to reality. So what we utilize ecosystems and plants for a lot is to grow food. And this just kind of gives you a picture. I'm sure you can't read it, not meant to be, but there's a lot happening over the earth of a lot of things interacting. So you have economics coming into play, and all these different things can be part of this system that we're trying to engineer, that we're trying to optimize. It's really complicated. Okay, so we know a lot. And we actually know a lot about ecosystems mathematically and engineering-wise. We can quantify a lot of these things. Instead of just saying, hey, those plants are doing better over there, we can actually throw an equation on that now and describe how they're doing better, how much better they're doing, and why, maybe why that is. So once we have that, we can put these big models together. So a lot of these different, again, you don't have to see all the different boxes, but each box maybe represents one of those graphs that I showed before. And so we can then start tying all these different relationships together, put it into one big model, and people do this to model ecosystems and climate all the time. We can make that big model, we can throw it in the blue water supercomputer, let it run, and see what happens 100 years from now or how the system will look. So we have this already. We have lots of different versions. This is just one version. It's actually kind of old. We have a lot of different iterations and different approaches to this. So my question, though, is we have this system, and right now we're just using it to describe what's happening right now, or describe or predict what may happen 100 years from now. Instead, could we maybe change the question and say, here's the goal that I want. I want something that looks like this or that does this. Can I utilize what I know about this system to pick out maybe the planting strategy or which species to use or how much sunlight to give it to make that optimal strategy or whatever you want to happen. So can we turn the question around? So when thinking about that, what we should ask is, okay, we're trying to create this optimal ecosystem and tweak all these equations to our benefit. What do we actually want it to do? What do we want an optimal ecosystem to do? So another way to ask that would be if you have bare black earth, let's say an acre of bare ground, which we should all be pretty familiar with because 96% of Illinois is this right now. What do you want it to do? So what do you think if you had a bare acre of land, you want to solve all the world's problems and create this great ecosystem, what do you want it to do? That's the actual question, so you can answer. Grow food. That's a very honorable thing to do. Anything else? Just as all we rely on food? Oil. Oil. Great. Fuel, right? How about what you're wearing? That's all comes from plant. Well, most of it nowadays comes from plants still. So fiber to make plants. How about to build your house with it? What else? Golfing, recreation, right? We enjoy nature. We want recreation. Anything else? Habitat. So biodiversity, habitat, kind of is recreation, but also can provide things like ecosystem services, which I would say we also want it to do. So what are some examples of ecosystem services that we would want an acre of land to do?
Fix carbon.
Fix carbon. Take carbon out of the air, put it in the ground. We need that for climate change right now, right? How about water? Our water is pretty dirty all over the world right now. What would you want to do to that water? Clean it, right? So what if we can make this acre of land do that too? What else? How about disease is a problem in the world, right? A lot of disease. So maybe we want a system like this to help mitigate disease or help stabilize disease factors. Okay, I'll stop asking. So here's an example. Educate students. Great. Education. They didn't consider that topic in this paper. But so here's just an example of some of the things that you would want an acre of land to do. We have crop production, infectious disease mediation, climate and air quality regulation, carbon sequestration, water quality, preserving habitats, and forest production. So just a subset of the things that you could potentially want something to do. And in this paper they looked at, here's a natural ecosystem, and here's just a way of presenting what that system is actually doing. So in general, that system is pretty good at a lot of things. And so that the yellow, kind of how far out this yellow bubble goes is how good it is at doing that. So it's pretty good at everything, but not so great at crop production. So you can think of a natural ecosystem. You can do the kind of forage kind of thing in it, but aside from that, it's not really productive on the food, at least as we know it today. And so our first attempt at making this better, this is the current way our approach is to making these systems better. So an example, annual agriculture is an engineered system, and it's very good at crop production all the way, the bubble goes all the way to the end there, but it's not very good at a lot of these other things. And so this strategy is a maximization type strategy. So we're going to talk here really quick about the difference between maximization and optimization. So the way we do that now is, this is a map of natural vegetation up here, but then this is where cropland is in the world and where pasture land is in the world. So the way our current strategy to approaching ecosystems now is we take 40% of our land and we say this is going to be maximum agriculture, just the maximal production that we can get out of agriculture. We're going to make it just do that. And then we take 10% of our land and we say this is protected. This is nature. This is a national park, and we're not going to touch it, and it's going to do nature and ecosystem services. And then we take 2% of our land and we live in it. And so we are really good at, or our current strategy is to segregate what we want to do, all those things that you said, and we say this is going to do that, and this is going to do that, and this is going to do that. The problem is when you kind of really simplify things like that, you need a lot of land to do that. So right now, the population is skyrocketing. We only have a finite amount of land, and so we're having trouble finding land because everyone wants to do, we have different interest groups. So they say, I want to build a house here. No, I want to put corn there. No, I want to make it a national park. You have this problem because there's all these trade-offs, and you can't really pick one of these things that you want to do because that's our strategy is to maximize things. And so if we go back instead and look at maybe what the goal is, and that would be to optimize the system. So again, now we have all these yellow bubbles going out on all the different qualities that we may want in an acre of land. And an important thing to note is that no single bubble is as far as it was as over here or up here. So this system is not as good at any one thing as these other kind of maximization systems, but collectively they will do more on an acre of land than a maximization type system. So this is more of an optimization strategy. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. So we're trying to engineer these systems, and we're talking about an optimal system as opposed to a maximal system. So can we actually do this? This is kind of the fundamental question I'm trying to ask here, is can we take our mathematical understanding of biology, and can we take the goals that we want an acre of land to do to make the world an awesome place and do all the things and solve problems that we need to be solved? Can we take those things, and can we create a system, artificially maybe, that does what we need it to do in an optimal way? Because we have, any other problem in engineering that we call an optimization problem, you have a certain number of variables, you have some constraint functions, you put it into Excel, you put it into your solver, you hit go, and it finds a solution. So couldn't we do it in this situation too? It's definitely a heck of a lot more complex, and there's a lot more components and a lot more nonlinearity, and that's great, but in theory, it's the same problem. It's still an optimization problem that a lot of people in here have already dealt with. So my answer is yes, we can do it, and it only takes 6 simple steps. And so this is maybe one approach to it. This isn't necessarily the approach, but this is the approach that kind of the people that I work with are taking to creating an optimal ecosystem in a way, or our version of what we want it to be. So step 1 is to pick your base natural ecosystem. Take that as your starting point. And for this example right now, we're going to use the oak savanna because that's what we do in our work. And so this is just a natural ecosystem used to dominate the Midwest. It's an oak savanna. That's your base system. Once you have that system, you should identify the structure and function of, or the structure and the different components of that system. Basically understand what you're working with. And so the way we do that with an oak savanna is we say 7 layers. It's kind of arbitrary and subjective, but in general you can say there's 7 layers in an oak savanna. We have canopy, which is dominated by oak because it's an oak savanna, but also some pine trees as you go farther north. Medium trees, as you go down a layer, you have crabapple and black cherries and wild plums and that kind of stuff. In the understory of that kind of shrub understory of that system, there used to be American hazelnut everywhere. Champaign County used to be covered with American hazelnut. I just found the only 2 acres left in all of Champaign County the other day, which is really cool. So there's some other shrubs. You have this bramble layer, which are typically your raspberries and blackberries, which anywhere you go, you walk through the forest, any preserves around here, you see it all over the ground. We have this ground layer of basically prairie grasses. You have a vine layer that kind of goes throughout everything, which around here is dominated by wild grape. Has anyone ever tried a wild grape? Tried eating it? Who has tried the candy, what are they, warheads? Sour warheads, right? That's what they taste like. And they have a big seed in the middle. And then we have this fungal layer, which is basically everywhere and has way too many species in it to talk about. So once you have those, so we now know what the system looks like, and this is a system that clearly does do a lot of things we want it to do. Now we're going to go in and go niche by niche and replace the species that are currently there with species that maybe help optimize one of the things that we're trying to do. So just give me a second here. So the left is the species in the natural system, and the right is what we're going to replace it with. So oak is great. It's a big tree. It's doing all those big tree services for the ecosystem. But who here has eaten an acorn or anything derived from an acorn? One person. Great. Did it taste very good? Terrible. OK, so probably not an optimal species to include in the food-producing system that we want to do. Instead, we're going to use chestnut. Chestnut is a tree that's also a large canopy tree. Looks very similar to an oak. It's actually from the same family. But who here has eaten something derived from a chestnut? Great, many more, right? And if you're in Europe, everyone will raise their hands. So it's already a common staple food. It's great. It tastes amazing. We like roasting them over open fires. It's great. We go to that middle story. We have crab apples and wild plums were the previous thing. Instead of crab apple, let's go same family, same genre, same everything. Let's put in our latest, greatest variety of green delicious, red delicious, whatever apple you want that's disease resistant, pest resistant, drought tolerant, all these great things that we've been breeding apples for the last 100 years. And then same thing with the other kind of fruit. American hazelnut, those hazelnuts that I found out in Champaign County were super, super tiny, like half of a penny kind of thing, and they were very hard to find and very small. We have hybrid hazelnuts that we've been breeding for 20 years that are huge plants, make huge nuts, make them really early in their life. They're drought tolerant, disease resistant, all those great things. Let's just substitute those in. Those hazelnuts are going to fill the same ecosystem role, the same niche. They're going to act in the same way in that ecosystem, maybe act in the same way in all the mathematics we talked about before, but they've been tweaked to be better for our specific optimization goals. Same thing with raspberries and blackberries. Here at the University of Illinois, in fact, we've developed thornless varieties. If any of you have picked blackberries, you usually end up with blood all over your hands by the time you're done. So let's use the thornless varieties and make that better for the optimization of harvesting or labor, safety. Wild grapes, again, tasted like warheads. We also have wine varieties and table grape varieties and all those great things. Same species, same everything. You just tweak it, and it's going to fill the same mathematical engineering type role, but it's doing something better for us. Prairie grasses, here at the U of I, we do a lot of research on making grasses better for biofuels, so you can stick those in instead. And then fungi, again, I'm going to gloss over because there's so many of them. There's wild species that aren't very edible, in fact, maybe poisonous. We could maybe put in some edible species that we've probably all eaten before. So you go kind of niche by niche, you fill those things in. Once you have your toolbox basically that you're going to work with, then you need to arrange them in some way. This is probably the most complicated part, but also the part I'm going to talk about the least because it's difficult. So coming back to the picture on my title slide, this is an example of arranging, actually almost the same suite of species I just mentioned, on a 100-acre farm. And so just, you can see that there's quite a bit of structure going on here, right? There's linear rows, it's very organized, there's a lot of thought put into it. So just to show you a few things. So up on this ridge up here, we have a row of tall windbreak trees. So if you think back to the math I've showed you before in the graphs, those trees are trying to alter the environment of those plants that are actually doing stuff for the farmer to change where those plants, how well they are at photosynthesis, how good they are at photosynthesizing, and those kinds of things. So we're trying to alter the environment inside. We're choosing linear, certain spaced rows because we want to optimize those characteristics of yield and harvesting, ease of harvesting, and labor. So we're including those as well in our system. If you look over here, we have maybe 20 different species that are growing in the same space at one time. So again, going back to those diversity production relationships, as you get more and more species, you're going to become more and more productive and more drought tolerant. So we're trying to do that here as well. There's a whole other bunch of things that, of all the math that I talked about, is all kind of being thought about and included here. So here's one example of then organizing things in an optimal way. And then once you do that, now you have to manage it in an optimal way. So I showed you some graphs that show that humans can influence their system. We're trying to do that. And we know we're trying to do that. So can we do that now in a way that optimizes some different characteristics? So this comes back to that succession plot that I talked about before. If you're trying to keep an ecosystem in some state along this curve, I would say that you probably want to keep it somewhere in here, right? Where you have lots of production. I told you this is kind of the weedy state. And as you get up here, you just kind of stagnate and you're not really doing anything. But in here you got this sweet spot that is overproductive. It's right in the middle. So what we can do is either by burning, grazing, cutting things down, all those different management techniques, we can, as that system is maturing, set it on fire and set it back a little bit. And we can kind of keep that system in the sweet spot so it's at optimal production. OK, so those are the steps basically to optimizing an ecosystem. That's one method of doing it. That's the way we're thinking about doing it. And so now I'm going to tell you a little bit, a few minutes left, of what we're up to and how we're taking those concepts and applying them on the ground. One thing is a couple of colleagues and I founded a nonprofit organization called the Restoration Agriculture Institute. You can kind of get out of our name a lot of things that resonate in this talk. Restoration, we have ecosystem services and natural stuff, and agriculture, which is kind of the engineering side of doing things that you want that system to do. And so we are pretty new. We started back in spring, but we're working with farmers and universities, and we want to do a lot of the research, expand the research that I've already talked about here, and then educate people, whether it's farmers or deal with universities to do education, and a lot of the outreach too. And then one of those projects that we're collaborating on and that I'm involved with here at the University of Illinois is a new research site that went in the day after finals in May. There were 3,200 trees planted, and this is kind of a schematic of what we have out there. It's a 5-acre research site, and you know, a lot of again, the text isn't important, but we have the green blocks here. We have 4 blocks of, it's going to be just a corn soil rotation. It's kind of our control that we know a lot about. It's the traditional ag system. It's our current approach to maximizing an ecosystem function. And then in the other blocks, here, the other 4, we have the suite of trees actually that I talked about from that savanna type system. So there's 6 species in here. They're organized in a supposedly optimal geometry. We chose species and varieties that are optimizing those different characteristics, and we will be managing it in that optimal sense. So we are going to be basically testing to see what the system can do. If this is our first approximation of this optimal system, how good is it? So we have a lot of qualitative data and a lot of observational studies from farmers and different organizations that say, hey, those trees over there, you know, they're working really well together, and you know, I haven't had any problems with this, and it seems good, and it makes intuitive sense that we have biodiversity and habitat, and that's great, but we don't have any of the like hardcore scientific replicated data that says that when you take the system and throw it in the ground, it can actually do those ecosystem services that we want it to do. It can actually grow a lot of food, and it can do so in an economically relevant way that is easy to harvest and actually easy to input into our current economic and processing system. So that's what we're working on down there. Like I said, the trees were planted in May. Right now they're really tiny and they're only, you know, a year or 2 old. And so we are applying for a lot of grants, and we're interacting with a lot of classes, and we have a lot of professors on board. So we're working with that. Next spring there's going to be a huge increase in what we're going to be doing out there. We're going to really be starting a lot of research projects, and if anyone wants to get involved in that stuff or just talk more about anything, this is my email address. You can email me and ask me anything. I'll take you out and show you the site if you want. There's not a lot to see right now. Basically everything already lost its leaves, so it's not very pretty. But if you want to come out, I can show you anyway, but also in spring. So get in touch with me and I can talk more about that. I hope that I kind of piqued your interest a little bit. Got the philosophy in there, pretty pictures, graphs, something for everyone, I hope. So I guess if people need to leave, I'm sorry that we went over. We kind of started a little bit late, but head out if you need to leave. If anyone has questions, though, you can still ask me as well. Thank you. Great. So I answered all your questions. Awesome. Or you're just really, really confused, don't know what I just said. Yes?
Whenever people lay out these very sensible and impressive scientific global arguments,
Yes.
the law of unintended consequences always comes bubbling up in my head.
Right.
Have you had any experiences with that law?
Yes, every day of my life. So I guess what I'm trying to say in this approach is that that issue comes up so much because when we try and do something, we tend to think of, okay, I'm going to produce this item, I want to maximize profit, and that's the one thing we're focused on. We're always focused on one variable and trying to maximize this and minimize this, and we basically do anything we can to make that happen. And so I'm not saying I have the answer or really know how to go about this, but if we think about it in more of an optimization type thing, where we include more variables and include different scenarios and different pluses and minuses, we can hopefully avoid those unintended consequences because we're considering them as part of what we're trying to improve. So whether or not that actually happens and whether or not you can actually remember or think of all the different variables you want to not affect negatively, that's a different story. But even if you just have 10, that's better than one that you're trying to maximize. So, yeah.
I guess going on with that, when you say you want to optimize an ecosystem, a natural ecosystem doesn't have a direction, but when you're optimizing something, there is an implied direction you want to go with that.
Right.
So, I guess as a steward of whatever ecosystem this is, who's to decide what direction an already stable system is going into?
Right. So that's why we only start with a natural ecosystem as like our base model, but then we have to do a lot to it to send it in a direction. And who makes that decision is whether it be a farmer or the company that's managing that. So, and every system is not going to have, so one thing I should mention is in complex problems like this, there is never one optimal solution, right? Usually we have more than one or maybe infinitely many optimal solutions. So just because you're starting to send something in one direction, that's not the only right answer. So if you have someone who really cares more about the recreational aspect and let's say the ecosystem services, you can only consider those variables in your equation and try and optimize the scenario for that. Different climates will have different answers, different regions or cultures will have different optimal answers as well. So I guess what's controlling it is all those different factors and your end goals. So, and those are going to be vastly different depending on where you are. The example I went through as I went through the steps is just kind of what we're talking about doing as a very Midwest-specific agriculture and ecosystem services specific example. But you can apply the optimization thing to anything. But not many people are doing it, so it's hard to say. Mm-hmm.
So in my practically thinking about this, this would be more applicable in like a fruit agriculture system that's already in place, like out in California.
Okay. That's a long answer. Do you have a short question? No. Great. Okay. Well, I'll talk about it because I just want to make sure if we have time, I mean, people can stay. Okay. So one thing I didn't talk about here. So this is going a little bit more into the details of this specific thing we're testing as opposed to the overarching philosophy. So in the system, we have 6 species. Those species are chestnut, hazelnut, grape, apple, raspberry, and currant. Who knows what a currant is? All right, great. People who don't know what a currant is, currants are what Europeans eat when we eat a blueberry or raspberry. Okay, good. So we have those 6 species, and they kind of do those different niches. And so our 2 core species are chestnut and hazelnut, which are actually nuts, not fruit. And so the reason we're choosing those, aside from that they have this kind of savanna relevance to them, is that I wish we could go back, but that would take a while. So hold on. We grow corn to make carbohydrate. We use carbohydrates for everything from cattle feed to human feed to cornstarch to baby diapers to paint. We put cornstarch in everything. And we use soybeans for oil and protein. And we use that for cooking oil, for sometimes biodiesel, which isn't as great. Soy protein is basically in every vegetarian item there is. So we use those things for a lot of different industrial ingredients. And so that, we're not trying to change that. Our entire economy is really based on those inputs, so carbohydrates, fats, and protein. So it's very important that we have those things. And we do view this as a total substitution for that. And the way we think about that is, okay, we have corn, which is a carbohydrate. We use it because it's carbs, not because it's corn. We don't care about that taste or smell or kind of flavor kind of thing. You know, we're processing it enough where you don't have all those things at the end. So chestnut is also it's a nut that happens to be 90+% starch. So you could, in theory, take a chestnut, grind it up, put it in the same hole in the same processing plant, take it out the other end, paint, baby diapers, animal feed, food, people food, all that kind of stuff. So it's the chemistry that we care about, not the actual plant it came from. So we're not interested in necessarily changing all that. We're interested in just changing the plant that it happened to come from, so it's part of this really cool system. And we're actually working with some professors here in the Ag and Bioengineering department to take some chestnuts and stick it in the corn processing equipment that we already have, this huge infrastructure that is probably worth billions and millions of dollars, and see what happens. So the machines are optimized right now for corn. If we stick a chestnut in, maybe we have to tweak a few valves and openings and temperatures, and maybe we can do the same exact thing with chestnut. Same thing with soybean and hazelnut. Soybean we use for oil and protein, and hazelnut happens to be a nut that is half oil, half protein. The protein is a complete protein. It is gluten-free, and there's no known allergy to it. And the oil is an oil that is pretty equivalent to olive oil as far as its utilization in cooking and how healthy it is for you as an edible thing. And actually, the biodiesel or fuel characteristics of the oil are way better than pretty much anything that we know of. Hazelnut is the second best oil-producing tree crop in the world, the first being macadamia nut, but that's not very important because it only grows in Hawaii and it's kind of a small range. The oil from hazelnut has a super low gel point, which for those who know a lot about biofuel or biodiesel is that you want that super low gel point so that your engine doesn't get clogged up with jelly oil when you start it up. So that's really important. So it's awesome for that, and actually the Department of Defense is looking into that for fueling the entire military with hazelnut oil, biodiesel. So again, though, in theory, the point is that you can take that food crop and stick it in the same hole in the same processing plant and get out the other end and get the same things. So those two species are the core of our system. We get them from the savanna analog that used to be native to here, but we modified them and we're using them as replacement commodity crops, if you will. And then all the fruit and stuff around it, in a sense, is just frill on top that makes it an ecosystem. So it's great that we're going to be getting a lot of our vitamins and minerals and kind of good things from those fruits and maybe veggies in the rows between the trees. But in a way, it's just there around that to make the ecosystem, and then we're going to kind of supplement our diet with all that other stuff too. And then I should mention, I talk a lot about plants because I'm a plant ecologist, but animals are important too. If we're trying to optimize an ecosystem, animals are part of an ecosystem, right? So in these alleys here, the white spaces between these rows of trees, which is about 25 feet wide or so at our specific site, you could plant your annual veggie crops like you want to in California. You could plant corn and soy if you want, which is what would probably happen as you're transitioning over. Or you can graze cattle or graze chickens or graze goats or whatever. And so we can integrate the animal component, which will be doing our disturbance, which is, remember, what we want to keep this in an optimal system. But they'll also be producing meat that we can then eat. In our specific research site, we probably won't be putting animals out there because of university rules, but we will be simulating that disturbance factor to optimize that ecosystem and calculating based on how many animals we can get off of it. So those are going to be a component as well. So that basically, hopefully, we're encompassing our whole diet in this kind of system and doing all this stuff. So my personal project at the site will be figuring out how much carbon the system can sequester, what it's doing with the water. Is it cleaning it? Is it stabilizing it? All that kind of stuff. So the ecology side of what it's doing for us. Yes. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but I didn't really talk more about the research side in the talk. So.
My question is, since you're kind of taking like all the thorns and stuff off the blackberries so that it's easier to harvest,
Yeah.
you're taking away that plant's like natural defense against other
Yeah.
animals coming to eat it. So, since part of the point is to help like clean the water of the area, wouldn't you have to put like things on plants to keep other like natural?
Yeah. So this is a really good example of. So every equation I had has just two variables on these graphs, but there's always trade-offs. There's always a much more complex relationship. So actually, the raspberries we used at our site, have thorns on them, because the thornless ones are a lot more expensive. So we have thorns, so that's what's going on there. But so you can think, if you take thorns off, you're going to increase maybe your yield, because people can get in there more. You'll decrease labor costs because they can go quicker because they don't have to worry about cutting themselves open. But you may also be decreasing yield because you have more birds coming in and eating things and those things. So that's just a perfect example of one of those things that you have to tweak in the system to see what is optimal and what isn't optimal. So a great supplemental study would be swapping in those different variations or different varieties and seeing which ones are better. And those are the things that we don't know of. And you can certainly actually probably write a pretty simple mathematical expression for what you're talking about, which, lower proportion of thorns equals easier yielding, but more and more damage from birds. And you can just probably see some nice bell curve or something, and you can try optimizing that. And then we can maybe make a variety of raspberry that is in that range. Maybe it has thorns but dull thorns or something like that, So that's just the perfect example of a trade-off. Yes?
You had a slide where you were showing the percentage of the world's land that's covered by different things like crops,
Yes.
uh, people, everything. And I think it added up to 52%. What's the other 40%?
Yeah.
Is that
Stuff that we don't find useful. So those percentages were of land area, so not including the ocean, but you can imagine like the Sahara Desert is a very large chunk. Siberia, we don't really consider those useful to us. Antarctica, those kinds of things, right? Or just kind of not useful things that maybe aren't being protected. So there's lots of wetlands in this country that aren't protected, so they're not very high quality, but we also don't use them to grow things, and we certainly don't live there. So I think if you go in the literature, they would call it maybe like degraded land or that kind of thing. So that's the rest of it. Yeah. But rest assured, engineers are working very hard to try and utilize all that land to get it into those percentages. Yes?
You showed a map and a graph earlier that showed that savannas were, or how prevalent savannas are in the world, and this is relevant to savannas. I'm wondering if you have any intentions of ever doing any research for the different types of ecosystems and how their systems adapt.
Yes. So again, this theory or framework or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, can be applied to any situation, any ecosystem. So you just start by picking a different base ecosystem. We're working on oak savannas because that's what used to be here, and that's what we are trying to work with. That's where we are. But you could take any other different savanna system or any other system. You could take a forest. And so a lot of the people that have done this before have done it in the name of permaculture or food forestry and that kind of thing. And they typically have worked with forests, and because they just really like forests for some reason. And so there's been a lot of work in that area, less work in savannas, and probably even less in kind of grassland systems. So as far as where we're going, I'd say right now we're really focusing on the Midwest, on the oak savanna system. That's what we know most about, and that's where we think there needs to desperately be a lot done. But then who knows where we can go from there. But it would be simple. You just go through the same framework, the same 6 steps or whatever, and kind of do the same thing. But what would be the hard learning curve is that at least I'm personally and people I work with are very familiar with the toolbox of species that we have to work with here, the species that work well in this climate, that we're familiar with, and the food that people like to eat. If I went to Africa, they have a savanna there, I'm not familiar with the native species there. There's probably a similar savanna structure, but the species are totally different. And I'm not familiar with the things they like to eat and the processing equipment they have available. So it would be a totally different optimal scenario, I guess. So you, again? Yeah?
So you're approaching this from a feed people standpoint, but are you considering taking the same approach into already natural ecosystems and then optimizing them?
Okay, so I guess my approach is twofold. So I'm really into so the feed people part and also just the sequester carbon and restore those services. So 2-pronged, that's really my focus. In fact, what my PhD might be on is more on the ecosystem service side, and then we're feeding people too. And then second part of the question was what? Natural ecosystems. So yes, no.
Yeah, okay.
Definitive answer, because so yes, you could go into a national park, which is this pristine ecosystem and is doing a lot of things right, and you could start cutting things down and managing it differently and do all those things, and you could do that. The problem is that we have such a low percentage of the natural stuff left that if you start doing that, we're not going to have any of it left. So we have, if you go back to that first map that I showed where like the land use for the United States was, that whole chunk of the Corn Belt was all, right now 96% of this state is bare black earth. If I'm going to start optimizing a system, I want to start with a blank slate. So we're lucky here. We chose a while ago an ag system that allows us to start with a blank slate every year. So we can start over every year, and at any point in time I can come in and say, I'm going to start here and I have a blank slate. But if you go into a national park, that's different. And also, we talked about ecosystem engineering is one way, but biomimicry is the other way. And so I didn't talk about it a lot, but a lot of, you can see that like what I'm calling the answer to the optimization problem is actually coming a lot from what the natural system is doing. And that's the biomimicry part of the natural system knows a lot of the best strategies. And so if we don't have the natural systems there to look at and learn from, how are we going to know how to use those ideas in our optimal system? So we're basing this on an oak savanna. Have you ever seen an oak savanna? No, neither have I. There's literally, so out of Champaign County, I think I told you this before, I found the last 2 acres of fairly pristine remnant oak savanna in the entire county. I've been searching for that for years. I've gone to Michigan, to Indiana, to Wisconsin, to Minnesota, all over to find just some even close approximation of what an oak savanna used to look like, but it's all gone. It is definitely the most endangered ecosystem in the United States. I wouldn't say the whole world. I'm not as familiar with all that, but we think about the rainforest being this, in dire trouble. But we think about that because that destruction is happening right now. The Amazon rainforest is being deforested the most rapidly of any system in the world. But we don't think about oak savanna because it was already done. 100 years ago when we brought the plow in, it was the same situation. It's already gone. So I find that very disheartening because I can sit here and talk all day about how I'm basing this new ag system on an oak savanna, and I can't show people an oak savanna to show that I'm, that I'm not making it up. Right now, I just have to go to the literature and say, hey, these guys 30 years ago had some more available to them, and they made all these observations, and so we're going to trust them. But otherwise, we've got to go out and just find these sites. So we don't want to go into the natural systems and do that. Yeah, we have plenty of blank slate to work with right now. Yeah. Okay.
You said replacement. That's just using the natural ecosystem as your model.
Right.
And then replacing the components.
Right. The different niches. So.
But restoring the bare.
Right. So if you look at this system from, like an aerial photo, if it didn't have the linear stuff, it would look like maybe what an oak savanna looks like if you look at it from far away. So it'll have the same 7 layers of big trees, small trees, that kind of thing. But if you come in and walk around on the ground, you'll see that's not an oak tree, that's a chestnut tree, or that's not big blue stem, that's switchgrass or miscanthus. So you'll be able to see the differences close up. But in theory, if the substitutions you make aren't terribly dramatic, and like we try to stay within the same family, same genus when we make the substitutions, the ecology should stay roughly the same, but you're tweaking the characteristics of that specific species. And again, you're not going to get as good of ecosystem services as the natural system, and you're not going to get as good of calorie production as you are in like a corn system, but you might get 90% on all of them, and they may be more optimal. You look really confused.
I'm not confused, I'm just thinking.
Oh, okay.
So you're not trying to completely restore the ecosystem. You're still approaching
Right.
it as an agricultural
Right.
land use.
Right.
Because it's feeding people.
Well, it's a new land use. It's an awesome land use.
It's,
Yeah, but yes. It will most likely be managed by farmers
yeah.
in that
but,
respect.
Saying that that the ecosystem processes will stay the same
Mm-hmm.
from the natural to the managed.
Go ahead.
Isn't, in my mind, correct. Like from the plant standpoint, it all stays the same because
Mm-hmm.
they'll interact the same with each other, but biodiversity won't be the same
Right.
that size will change, so you'll have different birds
Right.
or different
Yeah.
rodent species
Right.
coming in.
Yeah, so the best I can say for that right now is we don't know how different it'll be. So we don't know how sensitive a lot of those things you're talking about are to, let's say, changing nut size. You know, it certainly is probably sensitive, but the details are very difficult to know. So birds will show up. Different birds may show up. There are a lot of things that we're going to study at that site. Different insects may show up. That'll be probably the first thing to change, so we're going to measure that. And so the best way I can answer your question right now is, so in the natural system, things are working really well. You're getting really close to like awesome on all these different things. And in our system, it's not going to be all that way. So it is not going to work the best. That's why it's still a managed system. That's why the farmer will have to come in and deal with problems that arise or push the system to keep it over there. So it's not going to be as good over here, and it's not going to be as good maybe as crop production. But if you add up all the yellow here, it's more yellow than here and more yellow than here. So and so for an acre of land, you know, you may not get as much of one variable. But if you look at kind of a global scale, and instead of segregating all those different land uses to where we totally exclude other things, and start layering those on top of each other, maybe in the bigger picture, we'll start needing way less land to do all the different things we want to do, as opposed to saying we have to set aside these different areas. And so the optimization thing is on like a larger scale. But yeah, so it's not, every little ecosystem process is not going to stay the same. And that's why we need the natural ones to stick around to keep that stuff intact. Okay. Okay, time to go? Great. Thank you.